how did the British substitute the Japanese for themselves?
When the fog cleared, we saw we weren't shooting at British warships.
What was Nicholas II's response to Britain's demand to betray Russia's interests?
Nicholas II said, "No, that won't happen."
Why did the Anglo-Saxons secretly support the Bolsheviks?
The Bolsheviks were ready to use land as a bargaining chip.
The main principle of British power?
Divide and rule and unite and rule are the operating principles.
These are portraits of people who played a significant role in Russia's history. Supreme ruler of Russia, Admiral Kolchak, and Speaker of the Russian State Duma, Alexander Guchkov, Leon Trotsky, and Felix Yusupov. They all lived in different periods and their contributions to history is different too. But they are the same in one respect. All these figures put their trust in Britain, a country that has always been hostile to Russia, and that not only can't be trusted, but can't be allowed within firing range of the country. What defines a purely British provocation? How has London attempted to weaken and subjugate Russia through malicious cunning to dismember it? To pit Russians against each other and force them to fight each other, even though Britain doesn't really care who runs the country. Communists, liberals, Democrats or dictators, as long as it can achieve its goal. We found answers to these questions in declassified British archives and the archives of the US Library of Congress, as well as the Foreign Ministry, the Foreign Intelligence Service, and the Federal Security Service archives. Some of these documents have been declassified for the first time. How does a British provocation work? Nicholas II's Great Asian Programme. Only specialists remember this term today. Had it been implemented, we would probably be living in a completely different world today. Under that program, Russia was supposed to shift its geopolitical focus to Asia and gain a foothold on the ice-free southern seas and solve the problem of never-ending wars for the Bosphorus Strait and the Dardanelles. However, Britain was terrified of this prospect and used its influence on Tokyo to literally set Japan against Russia in order to stop Russia's advance into Asia. The Russo-Japanese War followed, in which the Russian Empire fought not only against the Japanese Empire, but the British Empire too, which took part in the war in a purely British fashion, pulling the strings behind the scenes. In the face of such a formidable foe, the Russian army, like in most military campaigns, gradually began to gain the upper hand. And then the British decided to use their tried and true weapon, dirty tricks. In the early hours of October the 22nd, 1904, the Russian fleet which was sent to help the besieged Port Arthur was in the North Sea. There was no presentiment of trouble. It was a typical passage of warships along an approved route. But when the Russian fleet was near the British city of Hull, the British staged a provocation that was breathtaking in its cruelty and cynicism.
There was an incident, the Dogger Bank incident, when several destroyers with lights off approached our fleet in the fog and opened fire. On Rozhestvensky's orders, our fleet returned fire, and when the fog cleared, it turned out that several fishing boats were sunk. The destroyers were hiding behind the trawlers, and we sank the trawlers. When the fog cleared, it turned out that we were shooting at fishing boats, not British ships. What happened next in Britain? Hysteria, with London saying, "That's it, it's war with Russia."
By the very next morning, the British authorities, with the blood of British fishermen fresh on their hands, were complaining to the whole world through the Reuters agency that Russian warships had barbarically shot at British fishing boats. On behalf of the international community, Britain wanted Russia to be severely punished. The offending Russian warships to return immediately to Kronstadt, and Admiral Rozhestvensky, allegedly guilty of the deaths of British soldiers, to be hauled before an international military tribunal. Few people remember today that the first international tribunal in history was created back then in order to condemn Russia for an alleged war crime. France, Russia's ally, was the first to give in. Unable to withstand international pressure, it was forced to declare that if Russia did not comply with the British demands, it would join the war against Russia on the side of Great Britain, along with its other European partners. International media spread the news of a nearly unavoidable war between Russia and Britain to every corner of the globe. Nicholas II had to undertake incredible diplomatic efforts in order to avoid opening a second front against Russia. However, even many years after the incident, when the truth of the Dogger Bank incident became known, no one in Britain was held responsible. Neither the Marquis of Salisbury, then head of the British government, nor First Sea Lord John Fisher. But how could anyone pull off such an operation without the approval of the top executives? By the way, this is most likely why the British archives from those years remain classified as top secret. Because if they were made public, it would be revealed that Prime Minister Salisbury was criminally responsible for the deaths of dozens of British sailors. And Lord Admiral Fisher is a war criminal. Truth to be told, not only the top figures are responsible for what happened. The Dogger Bank incident laid bare the baseness at the core of the British gentleman. The British fishermen did not suspect anything when they saw British warships making their way into their ranks under the cover of darkness, and even waved to what they thought were their defenders. But the thought of saving them never crossed those defenders' minds. This was just the first in a series of British provocations designed to contain Russia. Who was implicated in the toppling of Nicholas II? We older people may not live to see the decisive battles of the future revolution. It's hard to believe Vladimir Lenin said that. Even more surprising is the fact that Lenin said it in a public speech in Switzerland on January the 22nd, 1917, just a month before the February Revolution in Russia. The leader of Russia's professional revolutionaries had no idea that the Russian emperor was about to be overthrown and a coup would take place that would later be referred to as the February Revolution. So if the Russian revolutionaries were not behind it, who was? For many years, the official narrative was that popular fatigue with the war, defeats, retreats, and low morale were behind the February events. But is that really so? Let's start with addressing a simple question. Was the Russian army retreating at that point? Did it suffer defeats that could push people to rise up? No. On the contrary, the Russian army was extremely successful. Look at this map of the successful operations by the British Army in Galicia and the Carpathians in the winter and the spring of 1915, when the Russian cavalry had unexpectedly attacked the enemy after crossing the meter-high snowdrifts that had halted the infantry in its tracks. This is a map of the major victories by the Russian army on the Caucasian front, the seizure of Erzurum and Trebizond. During these military operations, the Russians also saved from defeat the British troops, whom the Turks were about to finish off. This World War I map reflects the overall situation on the front lines in December 1916. The Battle of Verdun, a tipping point in that war, had just ended, after which it was clear that Germany was losing. The reputation of Russian arms and people's patriotism were high. There was no reason for fatigue, and there were no defeats. So something else was behind the February coup and the sudden abdication of Nicholas II. What was it?
Britain, Russia's entente ally, along with the German Kaiser and Austrian headquarters, began to fund the Bolsheviks, and there are documents to back it up. How? Asks Austrian researcher Elizabeth Hershey. Alliance and family ties are nothing compared to the geopolitical prospect of Russia growing stronger in this strategic region which was the central node, the central nerve of Britain's European policy.
What must Russia's geopolitical prospects have been at that time, if Great Britain was ready to pull all kinds of tricks in order to prevent that scenario from unfolding? The answer lies here. This map shows the Bosphorus Strait, the Dardanelles, and Constantinople itself, Western Armenia and a portion of northern Kurdistan. All of that was supposed to go to Russia at the end of World War I. No one doubted it would win the war. These are not historical fantasies. This map is an attachment to the Sykes-Picot Agreement, in which Britain, France, and Russia, confident of victory, divided up territories among themselves. On behalf of Russia, this agreement was signed by Foreign Minister Sergei Sazonov. Great Britain was going to take the oil-rich territories that are now part of Iraq and Jordan. On the face of it, all members of the military alliance got what they fought for. However, Great Britain, considering its conquests legitimate, was reluctant to let Russia assume control of the Black Sea Straits and only formally agreed to those demands. What was it supposed to do? After all, Russia bore the brunt of the war. London started prevaricating and first asked Russia to keep these agreements confidential. However, Nicholas II quickly figured out the plans.
Nicholas II, for some reason, is considered a weak leader, was a devoted emperor, and there was no weakness in him, even though he appeared soft. He was the first in history to insist that the Allies sign an agreement, guaranteeing that a treaty would follow after the war, granting Russia, first, free access to the Mediterranean Sea, and second, control of the Bosphorus Strait and the Dardanelles. Moreover, the British and the French insisted on this treaty remaining confidential. But Nicholas II said, no, that won't happen. You will publish it in the press at home, and we'll publish it in our press as a provision of our future agreement.
According to the Russian emperor's terms, the secret agreement concluded on May 1st, 1916, was to be made public on April 1st, 1917, and enjoy the status of an international document. Had the Russian Empire held out for another year until the new agreements came into force, it would have been impossible to alter its geostrategic position in the world. But Britain could not agree to something that would strengthen Russia so much. Britain was ready to do anything, up to defeating Russia, its main ally on World War I, on the battlefield. This British rule justifying betrayal was articulated by the British political theorist Harold Joseph Lasky, who said, "Where the rules of the game make it impossible to win, English gentlemen change the rules." A representative of the British government, Lord Milner, was sent to Russia, which was still an ally, with an extraordinary and utterly hostile mandate.
Lord Milner presented an ultimatum to Emperor Nicholas II, demanding that he allow representatives of its Western allies, Britain and France, to participate in the Russian command, to which the Emperor responded with a firm no.
Why was Nicholas II against it? Because he knew the British well, and was also aware of the fact that British officers never left the headquarters of the High Command led by Grand Duke Nikolai Alexandrovich from the early days of war. Of course, there was nothing unusual about it, because the British were allies. However, as soon as the British decided that the Russian army's successes on the front lines were not good for them, Nicholas II began to receive reports that the enemy mysteriously always seemed to be aware of the plans devised by the Russian headquarters. Nicholas II realized that the British were behind it and were leaking information to the Germans. The Russian emperor decided to one-up the British and suddenly switched from anger to mercy and promised Lord Milner to continue to allow British representatives to attend secret meetings. but at the same time assumed command of the headquarters. That was Nicholas II's trick. If the monarch himself is present at the headquarters, the membership of the Allied missions must be increased many times over as well. Representatives of the Allies were invited to join the headquarters in any numbers, but there were so many of them eventually that they were not invited to the most important Allied meetings due to the sheer numbers of them. How do we know this? Here's an excerpt from a document from the Foreign Ministry archives. It's a letter by the head of the French military mission at the headquarters of the Supreme Command of the Russian Army, General Charles Janin, to the French ambassador to Russia, Maurice Palaiolog, that reads as follows. We are constantly asked to dinner parties and solemn award presentation ceremonies. As for the Russian command's plans, we know nothing about them. However, the British were not used to this. In January 1917, an Allied military conference was held in Petrograd. Its official agenda included final settlement of the territorial changes after victory. However, the British delegation had a different mission at the conference, affecting a change of government in Russia. Lord Milner, who had earlier presented Nicholas II with an ultimatum, was in charge of the conspiracy to overthrow the legitimate Russian government. We now know who Milner was counting on to carry out his plans. The Russian Duma opposition, including head of the Zemsky Union, Prince Georgy Lvov, chairman of the State Duma of the Third Convocation, Alexander Kuchkov, leader of the Constitutional Democratic Party, Pavel Milyukov, and chairman of the State Duma of the Fourth Convocation, Mikhail Rodzianko. As planned by the British, these opposition figures were to become a tool for overthrowing the Russian government with the use of their supporters. What did the plan entail? It was quite cynical. During the meeting, Lord Milner skillfully exploited the vices and insecurities of the liberal opposition. He promised power and distinction to the vainest of them, untold riches to the greedy, with everyone finally being accepted into the family of enlightened Europeans, not as representatives of barbaric Russia, but as heroic fighters for the ideals of freedom. All the opposition had to do to get there was betray their motherland, and what's more, push Nicholas II to bow to London. Or should the Emperor uphold Russia's interests, Britain would help the Russian opposition overthrow him. The British emissary vowed that London would spare no expense to hasten the revolutionary conflagration. Perhaps this was the only promise that he kept with the Russian traitors, because Prime Minister of Great Britain Lord George, who sent him to Russia, had been head of the Treasury until recently. Now, as Prime Minister, he still held the finances of the empire in his hands. And knowing how much he hated Russia, one could safely assume that, if necessary, he would cut the budgets for public health and education, as long as he could overthrow Nicholas II, who was proving such a nuisance to Great Britain.
Specifically, it was General Janin who claimed that Britain had allocated £20 million to fund the revolution in Russia. He said, for example, that a soldier was paid 25 rubles for not leaving the barracks or quitting military units. That was indeed a lot of money. And of course, their financial involvement was very strong. Remember, they were also lining the pockets of a variety of opposition leaders. Britain invested large amounts of money to destabilize the situation and to set the stage for the February coup.
If it were not for this conspiracy involving pseudo-democratic detractors of the monarchy in the British Parliament, which itself directly sponsored the coup, then after the Russian army's convincing victories in the 1916 military campaign, Nicholas II would have remained in power. And perhaps Russia's history would have taken a different turn. It is impossible to know. The British themselves, or rather the most respected Englishman of the 20th century, Winston Churchill, said so. In his book, The World Crisis, 1916 to 1918, he wrote about the last Russian emperor, Nicholas II. The Tsar was on the throne. The Russian Empire and the Russian army held out. The front was secured and victory is indisputable. In spite of errors, vast and terrible, the regime he personified, over which he presided, to which his personal character gave the vital spark, had at this moment won the war for Russia. This is corroborated by Prime Minister of Great Britain David Lloyd George. As we know from eyewitness accounts, having learned the news of Nicholas II's abdication from the throne, the British Prime Minister smugly said for everyone to hear, "One of the main goals that England set in this war has been achieved." A quip that speaks volumes. Great Britain believed it had won the war. But what did those who believed its promises and betrayed their people and sovereign get? Guchkov, Milyukov, Lvov, Rodzyanka, and others. All of them learned just how reliable their English friends were when, in exile, they were forced to obediently follow the orders of their handlers in the security services until their last days, who treated them worse with every passing day, because traitors deserve no respect. The only thing that can be counted on as a positive outcome of this story is that Russia learned the right lesson, and Britain will be held responsible for it sooner or later. British claims that history should be left to historians can't be taken seriously. Who betrayed the White Army? The title of this map is "The Young Soviet Nation Encircled by Enemies." This is from a Soviet paper in 1918. From one direction, the Bolsheviks were attacked by an 80,000-man army, led by General Wrangel. From the other direction by a group of more than 200,000, led by General Denikin. And from a third direction by the 100,000-strong White Guard units, led by Admiral Kolchak. It's widely accepted that the Whites enjoyed extensive Western support. It's a pattern that repeats in Russian history about every 100 years. The countries of Europe unite to contain Russia, divide and dismember it, and force it to fight with itself. And it's happened this time too. Europe took the side of the Whites. It's a miracle that the Reds managed to hold on in these circumstances. How did they do that? To find the answer, let's turn to the archives. Here are the documents from the Foreign Ministry's archives. A letter from Trotsky, then chairman of the Revolutionary Military Council of the RSFSR, to People's Commissar for Foreign Affairs of the RSFSR, Chicherin, dated November 16, 1920. It reads in part, "Britain played an evil role in connection with the Crimea. It suggested that Wrangel surrender and demanded amnesty. Again, we agreed to liquidate the Crimean front and to offer amnesty. Britain promised to send its representative. Curzon thuggishly threatened to destroy our unprotected cities and misrepresented the situation to suggest that Wrangel was seeking peace, but we rejected the offer. When we did as Curzon wanted us to and waited for Wrangel to advance with weapons supplied by the British, Curzon turned his back. It's hard to think of anything more shameful than Britain's conduct in this matter." An interesting letter. It looks as if Trotsky is denouncing Britain and calling its behavior shameful. But on the other hand, even without probing the letter deeper, there is a strong sense that some kind of conspiracy is afoot. As if the Bolsheviks, in the person of Trotsky, are talking about something that they had agreed up front with Britain. And Britain is violating those agreements, to Trotsky's consternation. This raises another question. What deal did Britain make with the Bolsheviks behind Wrangel's back? That is, behind the backs of the Whites. What did the deal mean for the Reds and the Whites? To answer that question, other documents from the Russian Empire's public archives need to be considered. For example, this report drafted by White officers makes it clear what's happening at the moment between Britain and the Entente Allies and the Reds. And also between Britain, the Entente Allies, and the Whites. This special telegram sent by the Russian White Guard mission in Athens to the Omsk government of Kolchak on May the 19th, 1919 reads as follows. General Denikin wants Admiral Kolchak to know that first, the French unexpectedly evacuated Odessa on March the 21st and 23rd within 48 hours, leaving significant amounts of material behind in the absence of any attack by the Bolsheviks. Second, the French, who promised to hold Sevastopol, are in a precarious position as well. And the situation in Sevastopol is hopeless. Third, the British are quite friendly and even offered the services of their equipment technicians. It follows from this letter that Europe promised to support Kolchak, but failed to keep its word. The units of the European allies left their positions and left Kolchak face to face with the Reds, which Kolchak did not expect. It follows from the letter that the British sweetened this bitter pill for the Whites at first, which is even more alarming. Whenever the British make a gesture of goodwill, brace for dirty tricks, which is exactly what followed. Here's another document from the public imperial archives. In the telegram sent by Prince Trubetskoy, who headed General Wrangel's mission in Turkey, to head of the Russian diplomatic mission in Constantinople, Miratov, dated June the 13th, 1919. The prince reports the sad news. Having returned from the front lines, the commander-in-chief invited General Percy and informed him that he was about to complete the occupation of the territory that General Percy said was necessary to resupply Crimea. Reaching out to the British government through General Percy, General Wrangel asked it to clarify whether actual guarantees were going to be made regarding the inviolability of the territory occupied by the armed forces in southern Russia, in the event the talks planned by the British government with the Bolsheviks do take place. So what is the point of the conversation? And why was Wrangel so worried? At that time, General Percy was heading the British military mission in Crimea. Simply put, Wrangel told the British general that he was aware of the fact that the British had reached an agreement with the Bolsheviks, and that the British were going to betray Wrangel. That is, leave him without support and hand Crimea over to the Bolsheviks. It can be inferred that Wrangel was no longer asking the British for anything. He was only asking whether the British could provide him with security guarantees after the British and the Bolsheviks strike a final deal. It turns out that the British support for the White Movement was greatly overrated for many years. However, at some point, the British betrayed the White Movement and sided with the Bolsheviks.
When Wrangel found himself in Crimea, Western allies did not recognize a single white government, not a single one. Only France recognized Wrangel. Britain did not recognize him and wanted Kolchak to cease hostilities, start talks with the Bolsheviks, and stop fighting altogether.
It may look at first glance that the British policy towards the White Movement didn't make much sense. Early on, leader of the House of Lords of Great Britain, Lord Curzon, threatened to bomb Russian cities occupied by the Bolsheviks if they would not let Wrangel's army go. Later, those same British diplomats wanted the Whites to lay down their arms before the Bolsheviks, or they wouldn't get any help. What did the British really want? The British answer this question themselves in this excerpt from the British Prime Minister Lloyd George's speech in the House of Commons on September the 17th, 1919. Let's take a real look at our issues. Kolchak, Denikin, Petlura, all these are anti-Bolshevik forces, and everyone has a goal: restoration of a united Russia. So it's not for me to tell you whether such a policy is in the interests of the British Empire. Even the great Lord Beaconsfield wrote that the huge, gigantic, colossal and growing Russia poses the greatest threat imaginable to the British Empire. Here's the answer. Why did the British sense an opportunity in supporting the Reds and betraying the Whites? Because the end result of the Red experiment in Russia was still far from clear. However, if the whites win, they might immediately start restoring Russia as a great power. The British sensed that right away.
They collaborated alternately with the whites and the reds before ultimately betraying the whites because they stood for a united and indivisible Russia, while the Bolsheviks were ready to trade away land. Here is how the betrayal in Arkhangelsk played out. The British said they would withdraw their troops. The agreement was reached with Litvinov by telegraph. He was in Stockholm at the Versailles conference and met with Lloyd George. I had the chance to read the documents in which the British said they would withdraw their troops, essentially leaving the whites to the mercy of the Reds.
The chain of events culminated in mid-September 1919, as Denikin's troops were making successful advances towards Moscow. The Bolsheviks were inside a circle of front lines and nearly spent, with no troops or reserves. But help came from an unexpected source, the Poles, who had been on the march on the Western Front. They suddenly stopped advancing. The Bolsheviks withdrew troops from the Polish front and sent them to fight Denikin, and won. Why did the Polish army suddenly halt? Is there an answer to that question? Yes. Here's a document that was found in the Foreign Ministry's archives not long ago. It's a secret message sent by chairman of the Revolutionary Military Council of the RSFSR, Trotsky, to People's Commissar for Foreign Affairs, Checherin. Reportedly, Poland asked Britain for mediation between it and Soviet Russia. It is likely that this message is premature, but no doubt if Poland had to ask for peace, it would do so through the Entente government. It's not hard to understand the point of Trotsky's letter regarding Britain's mediation between Soviet Russia and Poland. London wanted the Bolsheviks to defeat Denikin outside Moscow, and that's why it persuaded Poland to start peace talks with Moscow immediately. Having received ironclad guarantees from London, the Bolsheviks sent troops from the Polish front to fight Denikin, and that was game over. That's how the White Movement fell victim to British betrayal. In effect, the British saved Soviet power. Sure enough, the British detested the Soviet government. But it was the lesser evil for London compared to the revival of the Russian Empire, which is what the whites were trying to achieve. That's the real reason for the string of betrayals and provocations committed by the British. Promise and rule. Many are aware that Finland, Poland, and even a portion of modern Turkey were part of the Russian Empire back then. But only historians know that a significant portion of Persia was within Russia's sphere of influence before the empire collapsed. However, when the October Revolution broke out in Russia, not only the government changed, but also the new government's approach to the Russian Empire's territories. The Bolsheviks began to break up and hand out land to all comers. Just like that, the Bolsheviks ejected Persia from Russia's sphere of influence. In addition, having ceded a vast swathe of Persian territory, the Bolsheviks formally gave away the property owned by the Russian Empire free of charge to local rich landowners called bais in Farsi.
The Soviet state took the decision to donate to Persia everything that Imperial Russia had owned under various concessions. These included highways in northern Persia, the Discount and Lending Bank of Persia, and concessions for the development of various mining resources, to name a few. National democratic movements were taking shape. They were seeking freedom from foreign domination.
Now it was Britain's turn to be surprised. For so many years, Britain had been engaged in a life and death struggle with Russia for dominance in this part of the world. And suddenly, after the change of government, Russia began to cede territories that it acquired in a fair fight with Britain. That was something to ponder. The British quickly realized that this unexpected victory could prove illusory, because the former Persian subject of the Russian crown, who the Bolsheviks let go, may inspire other peoples in that region to seek independence from the British Empire. So, to keep the peoples of Asia locked in their sphere of influence, the British decided to launch a preemptive strike.
A decision was made to carry out these objectives. It entailed sending a number of military political missions which went to that region. These included a mission headed by General Lionel Dunstable, which traveled to northwestern Persia and the South Caucasus. Another mission, led by General Wilfred Malleson, headed to Mashhad. And yet another mission, overseen by Frederick Bailey, went to Tashkent.
So the British military missions arrive in the troubled region to protect London's vital interests. Make no mistake, having arrived in Turkestan, the British didn't set out to restore law and order by fire and sword. What strategy did they use instead? These documents from the British military archives contain the answer. This is an excerpt from an expense statement of the British military mission in Turkestan. Cabled details of the expenditure of General Malleson to date, which was as follows. Pay charges, £15,000. Secret Service, Turkestan, £37,000. Other Secret Service, £13,000. Other charges, £5,000. Charges of military forces, unknown. Road making, £9,000. Payment to Ashgabat government for rations supplied, £100,000. Subsidy in December, £100,000. Maintenance of railway service, £80,000. Payment to Ashgabat government in December, £17,000. Expenses of withdrawals, estimated £100,000. Total, £476,000. So what do we have here? Almost £500,000 sterling was spent, which is a significant sum of money even now. Back then, and in one of the world's poorest regions, it was astronomical. However, the individual budget items are more stunning than the amounts. What did the British spend money on? Not weapons or military operations. You can see that spending to support military forces has a question mark. But there is an interesting line. Financing the Ashgabat government. What are those expenses for? After all, the British don't part with money for nothing. In Turkestan, the British used tactics tried and tested many times before. Why fight the national liberation movement if you can lead it? You want autonomy? Go ahead, have it. We'll even give you some money to go with it. The full treachery of the trick is revealed later. When the local power brokers, with Britain's money and guarantees to help in a war against their neighbour, start fighting, truly believing that they are Britain's preferred allies. Later, when they had their fill of fighting, London proceeds to the second part of the plan. Britain goes to the region to make peace among the warring sides it recently pitted against each other. You can imagine just how peaceful the process of uniting die-hard opponents was.
Divide and rule and unite and rule were the operating principles. Irreconcilable factions had to be united when they were leaving the former colonies. How did they draw the borders? Well, they drew borders like a patchwork quilt, dividing one tribe in half, or uniting two warring tribes in one country.
But why did the British need the former outskirts of the Russian Empire? The answer's simple. Oil, which after the collapse of the Russian Empire was up for grabs, because the Bolsheviks were focused on survival and showed no interest in holding on to it.
In addition to the Caspian coast, they went on to occupy the Black Sea coast, captured Batumi and the entire Black Sea fleet, and began to pump oil in Baku and transport it to Britain via the Black Sea, as if a pipe started flowing from Baku to Britain at the flip of a switch.
But the British feast in this part of the former Russian Empire did not last long. Speaking before Parliament on January the 16th, 1919, British Prime Minister Lloyd George said, "It is impossible to keep British soldiers in Russia longer because of the threat of a revolution by the local population." As a result, the British military mission quickly packed and left Turkestan in an act of betrayal. They abandoned the puppet governments that had wallowed in British money and assurances of eternal British friendship to the mercy of local clans. Two years of British games with the separatist governments resulted in millions of lost lives with no legitimate government emerging in the end. If we were to end the history of the British adventures in Turkestan at this point, it would appear the British lost. But of course, that's not true. The British Crown was pleased with the results of its heinous provocation. The amount of crude oil that the British exported in 1918 and 1919 by exploiting loyal puppet governments amounted to an astronomical 113.5 million golden rubles. That's over $11 billion at today's rate. And that's only the officially released numbers. Owing to the Turkestan operation, throughout the 1920s, Britain, without producing a single drop of oil on its own territory, was the world's largest oil seller, supplying more than 11% of crude oil to the world market. To put that in perspective, Saudi Arabia accounts for under 7% of the global market today. When did Britain's Russophobia begin?
You have to go back all the way to the 1830s, which is when the phenomenon of British political Russophobia began. The writings of a number of public and political figures in Great Britain were responsible for laying its foundations. The key message here was to act on the country's aggressive and expansionist intentions.
What was going on between Russia and Britain during those years? Let's take a look at the declassified archives. This is a report by Russian ambassador to Great Britain, Prince Levin, to Vice-Chancellor of the Russian Empire, Count Nesselrode. The Russian ambassador reports that two influential Polish nobles, Count Walewski and Marquis Wilepowski, secretly arrived in London. To understand why the Vice-Chancellor of the Empire became interested in two Poles going to London, look at the date of the message, April 1831. A separatist uprising was raging in Poland, which was then part of the Russian Empire. As we read on, the declassified letter shows why it was classified in the first place. The Polish envoys met with British Prime Minister Charles Grey, Foreign Secretary Palmerston, and other members of the British government. The purpose of the visit was to ask the British authorities to provide direct military assistance to the Poles and to use Great Britain's influence to encourage the Western European powers to intervene diplomatically in the effort to settle the Polish issue. So the Russian Emperor learned from this secret letter that the Poles were secretly asking the British to provide weapons for a war against Russia, and that London was willing to secretly provide those weapons to the Poles. As you may be aware, the Polish uprising began in the early hours of November the 29th, 1830. With a string of killings of unsuspecting sleeping Russian aristocrats, including Grand Duke Konstantin Pavlovich Romanov. How did London react to the vicious massacre of Russian aristocrats?
Not long ago, the speeches made in Parliament on the Polish issue were made public. It caused an uproar in Britain. This kind of not just anti-Russian, but plainly Russophobic hysteria was unheard of. But they did it and fomented a tremendous amount of hatred towards the Russian Empire.
However, other than hatred, what else did the British provide to support the Polish rebels? Did they send weapons as promised? Did they give them money as planned? No. This document shows how Britain helped the Poles, whom it had been nudging towards an uprising for so long. This is another declassified letter sent by the Russian ambassador in London to St. Petersburg. Instead of a constitutional charter, a constitution of the Kingdom of Poland of 1815, which was originally going to be published, the revolutionary government drafted a constitutional charter of the Kingdom of Poland. The tract itself, containing a list of violations of the Polish constitution by the last administration of the kingdom, was published in London in 1831 as Marquis Wielopolski's work. For those who haven't already figured out what the report was about, here's how the story ends. Ultimately, the British did not give any weapons or money to the Polish rebels. Instead, the British forced the Poles to write anti-Russian pamphlets and articles in the European press for them. The British did allocate money to publish those articles and pamphlets. The money came from the military budget and helped place articles in European publications. Those Polish gentry hotheads saw it as a disgraceful failure of their mission. And Marquis Wielopolski and his comrade did not return to Poland until the end of the uprising. Furthermore, having realized that the British had roped them into this uprising and cynically took advantage of them, the Marquis changed sides and faithfully served the Russian Empire to the end of his life. How did that epic British provocation end?
They waited for the uprising to die down and eventually be quelled. And when all manner of immigrants started to appear around Europe, they began to make use of them. They did not actually support them. They just exploited them to form a particular public opinion and to maintain a certain degree of hysteria. From those times on, in the 1830s, bellicose Russophobia became, I would say, a major component of British foreign policy.
Of course, Poland and Russia ultimately emerged as losers. The uprising claimed thousands of Polish and Russian lives. But what did Britain gain from that monstrous provocation? The fact is that after the Napoleonic Wars, Europe feared the Russian army, and starting a military conflict with the Russians was considered suicide. The bloodless revolution broke out in Britain in 1830 when, following electoral reform, the bourgeoisie obtained a majority in Parliament. Scared of the not-so-bloodless bourgeois revolutions in France and Belgium, the landed aristocrats yielded without a fight. The Russian Emperor Nicholas I chose to restore order by military force in France and Belgium. What were the British supposed to do? Fight? Why fight if you can sacrifice the Poles? By successfully pulling off its cynical provocation with the Polish uprising, the British not only implicated the Russian Emperor in a fratricidal war, which of course forced him to stop helping European monarchs, but also furnished a reason to remain Russophobic for decades to come. Like the bite of a viper, the venom of a British provocation does not kill, but causes pain for a very long time. Great Britain used this technique in the 19th century, and some say is still using it today. In conclusion, we can say that hundreds of thousands of people were killed and millions of people were robbed of their possessions as a result of cunning British provocation. If someone committed even a tiny fraction of those crimes, they would be sentenced to life in prison. But what can one do against a criminal country? It must be kept in international isolation before it happens again. But British gentlemen should remember what the great Bismarck once said. Do not ever hope that having taken advantage of Russia's weakness once, you will be receiving dividends forever. Russians always come back for their money. And when they come, do not place hope in Jesuit agreements that you signed and that allegedly justified your actions. They are not worth the paper they are written on. So your best bet is either to play with the Russians honestly or not play at all. Those who sit down for a game of cards with British political hustlers should learn once and for all that their deck has the same marked cards and is stacked against them. Narcissistic Anglo-Saxon exceptionalism, crude lies and slander, playing fast and loose with facts, breeding traitors, ignoring aristocratic rules of conduct, and deceiving those whom they have fraudulently imposed themselves on as allies.